On an ordinary afternoon in late summer, a Roman city of 20,000 people went about its business. Bread was baking in stone ovens, wine was being poured, politicians were arguing, a dog was chained to a doorway. 18 hours later, none of it existed. Not the bread, not the dog, not the city. Buried under 20 feet of ash and stone, Pompeii would disappear from the surface of the earth for nearly 17 centuries. And when it was finally uncovered, what archaeologists found was not ruins in the usual sense. It was a city caught in the moment of dying. Loaves still in the ovens, coins still on tables, bodies still mid-gesture. This is the story of a place where time did not pass. A city that was buried alive, and what its silence still tells us about the day the sky turned black. Most ancient cities erode slowly, walls crumble, wood rots, paint fades. What survives is fragments, foundations, outlines, a column here, a coin there. Archaeologists spend lifetimes reconstructing what the centuries took away, but Pompeii does not behave like that. Because Pompeii was not abandoned, it was not weathered, it was not stripped by later builders for stone. It was sealed. In a matter of hours, an entire functioning Roman city was covered so completely and so quickly that what should have decayed simply did not. Frescoes kept their color, wax tablets kept their writing, food kept its shape, streets kept their wheel ruts, and the people who could not escape kept the position they died in. This is what makes Pompeii unlike anywhere else. You are not looking at a ruin. You are looking at a Tuesday afternoon in the year 79, preserved by the same disaster that destroyed it. To understand how that happened, you have to begin not with the eruption, but with the mountain that no one believed was a mountain. Chapter 1. The city that forgot its mountain. For most of its history, Pompeii lived in the shadow of something it did not recognize as dangerous. Mount Vesuvius rose over the Bay of Naples in a long, gentle slope, green to the summit, covered in vineyards. Wine from its lower flanks was famous across the empire. The Romans called it fertile. They called it beautiful. They did not call it a volcano, because by the 1st century, Vesuvius had been silent for so long that the word no longer applied to it. Its last major eruption lay somewhere in deep prehistory. No living Roman had ever seen it active. No record described smoke rising from it. No tradition warned against building near it. To the Romans, it was simply a mountain. A high one, useful for agriculture, pleasant to look at from the coast. And so Pompeii grew at its base without fear. By the year 79, the city held an estimated 20,000 people. It was a working Roman town, not a capital, not a wonder, but prosperous, well-connected, and dense with daily life. Stone-paved streets crossed the city in a tight grid. Shops opened onto the sidewalks. Bakeries pressed against laundries. Brothels operated openly, advertised by small carvings near their doors. Public baths ran continuously, heated by furnaces beneath the floors. And at the center, the Forum gathered politics, commerce, and religion into one open square framed by columns and statues. This was not a backwater. It was a working piece of the Roman world. A trading port linked to Rome itself by road. A vacation destination for wealthy senators who built villas along the coast. A place where freed slaves could become merchants. Where election slogans were painted on outer walls. Where a graffito scratched into stucco might survive longer than any of the people who read it. And throughout the city, Vesuvius was visible. From the Forum, from the rooftops, from the entrance of nearly every villa. Locals saw it every morning when they opened their shutters. They saw it every evening when the sun dropped behind it. It was part of the skyline, part of the view, part of nothing dangerous. There is even a surviving fresco from a Pompeian house showing the mountain as it was remembered before the eruption. Soft slopes, vines, a single peak, not the broken twin summit it became afterward. This is the Vesuvius the city knew, the Vesuvius it trusted, the Vesuvius that did not yet exist as a threat. And in the years before the eruption, the ground had given warnings. Small earthquakes were common in the region. A larger one struck in the year 62, 17 years before the disaster, and damaged buildings across Pompeii. Walls cracked, statues fell, temples needed rebuilding. But the Romans rebuilt because earthquakes were familiar. Earthquakes were not eruptions, and nobody connected the tremors beneath the soil to the mountain above it. In the days leading up to the eruption, the warnings grew sharper. Springs and wells in the area began to dry up. Small tremors increased. Animals were reportedly uneasy. But to a Roman city accustomed to occasional earth movement, none of it read as catastrophic. Life went on. The bakery fires were lit. The forum filled. The market opened. And somewhere above all of it, deep beneath the green slope of Vesuvius, pressure was building towards something the city had no concept of. Because Vesuvius was not an extinct mountain, it was a sealed one. And the difference between those two things was about to define everything. Chapter 2. The day the sky turned black. The eruption began around midday. The exact date is still debated. Traditionally placed on August 24th, more recently suggested as October based on evidence from the site itself. But the sequence of what happened in the hours that followed is now known in extraordinary detail. It began with a sound, a deep, low report from the direction of the mountain. Not thunder. Not an earthquake. Something heavier. Something rising. From the streets of Pompeii, people would have looked up to see a column of smoke and ash climbing above Vesuvius at a speed nothing in their experience prepared them for. Within minutes, that column was higher than any structure they had ever seen. Within an hour, it had risen miles into the atmosphere. It is the same kind of eruption that scientists today still call by the name of the man who described it from across the bay. A Plinian eruption. A vertical column of gas, pumice, and ash forced upward by enormous pressure, spreading outward at the top into a shape that contemporary witnesses compared to an umbrella pine tree. That description has survived because one of the few first-hand accounts of the eruption came from a teenager watching it from the town of Misenum, about 20 miles across the bay. His name was Pliny the Younger. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, a famous naturalist and the commander of the Roman fleet stationed nearby, sailed toward the disaster to help with rescue operations. He never came back. Years later, the nephew wrote 2 letters describing what he had seen, what he had heard, and what his uncle had done. Those letters are now one of the most important eyewitness accounts of any natural disaster in the ancient world. He described the column of smoke. He described the darkness falling over the bay. He described ash beginning to land on Misenum, miles away. He described people running with cushions tied to their heads to protect themselves from the falling stones. And from his account, archaeologists and volcanologists have reconstructed what happened in Pompeii itself, hour by hour. In the first phase, after the initial blast, the city did not burn. It rained, but not water, pumice, light, porous volcanic stone ejected from the column above and falling back to Earth across a wide area. At first it was light, small pieces almost like hail. Within hours it was knee-deep in the streets. Within 12 hours it had reached the second floor of buildings. The weight became too much. Roofs began to collapse. People who had taken shelter inside their homes, believing the danger would pass, found themselves trapped under falling timbers and stone. But many had already fled. Many residents likely escaped during this first phase. A large share of Pompeii's population may have made it out before the final surges arrived. They ran toward the harbor. They ran toward the gates. They ran toward the countryside. They carried what they could: coins, jewelry, lamps, children. The streets, when archaeologists later excavated them, were full of evidence of that flight. Small abandoned objects dropped along the way, but the pumice phase was only the beginning. Around midnight, the eruption changed. The vertical column above Vesuvius could no longer sustain itself. It collapsed. And when a Plinian column collapses, it does not fall straight down. It rolls outward, down the slope of the mountain, across the land, at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour, at temperatures hot enough to ignite wood instantly. These are pyroclastic flows, and they were what killed everyone still inside Pompeii. The first surges did not reach Pompeii directly. They moved north and west, destroying the town of Herculaneum closer to the mountain with such speed that residents had no time to react. In Herculaneum, archaeologists later found groups of people huddled in boathouses along the shore, where they had gathered hoping for rescue by sea. The flow reached them at several hundred degrees. Their bones were preserved. Their lives ended in seconds. In Pompeii, the death came later. Around 6 or 7 in the morning, roughly 18 hours after the eruption began, a pyroclastic flow finally reached the city. By then, anyone still inside had been there for hours. Some had stayed because they were elderly, some because they were sick, some because they were injured by collapsing buildings, some because they could not abandon what they owned, some because they believed the worst had already passed. The flow entered Pompeii from the north. It moved through the streets at the speed of a freight train. It carried ash, gas, and superheated air. When it passed over a person, death was almost instantaneous, caused not by burning, but by thermal shock and asphyxiation. The bodies fell where they stood, or where they crouched, or where they tried to shield a child. And then the next flow came, and the next. Layer after layer of ash and pyroclastic material, settling over the city until everything was sealed beneath 20 feet of volcanic debris. By the end of the second day, Pompeii had stopped existing. The bay was choked with floating pumice. The sky over the region was black at noon. Ash had fallen as far as North Africa. And on the surface where a city had stood the morning before, there was nothing. No buildings, no streets, no bodies, only a smooth, gray plain. Vesuvius had not just destroyed Pompeii, it had erased it. Chapter 3: The City That Time Forgot. For nearly 1700 years, Pompeii was simply not there, not as a memory, not as a legend, not as a place anyone tried to find. The Roman Empire knew the city had existed. There are scattered references in later writings. Some survivors of the eruption, including Pliny the Younger, described it. But within a few generations, the precise location had blurred. The land above the city was eventually farmed again. Vineyards returned to the slopes of Vesuvius. A new town grew nearby, called Torre Annunziata. Roads were built, wells were dug, and occasionally a farmer's plow would strike something unexpected. A piece of marble, a coin, a fragment of painted plaster. But nobody connected those finds to a buried Roman city. Pompeii had become invisible, not destroyed in the imagination, just gone. That changed in the late 16th century when workers digging a water channel from the Sarno River accidentally cut into walls covered in frescoes. They reported the find. Nothing was done. The site remained closed for another 150 years. Real excavation did not begin until 1748, under the Bourbon kings of Naples, who were already digging at the nearby site of Herculaneum. What they found stunned them. A city, intact beneath the ground. Not ruins in the traditional sense. Buildings still standing to their second floor. Streets still paved, frescoes still bright on the walls. But the early excavations were less archaeology than treasure hunting. Statues were removed. Frescoes were cut from walls and taken to royal collections. Buildings were dug into and abandoned again. It was not until the 19th century, under the Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli, that Pompeii began to be excavated systematically. And it was Fiorelli who solved the mystery of the bodies, because as the workers dug, they kept finding strange voids in the volcanic ash, hollow shapes, cavities the size of a person or a dog or a piece of furniture. For decades, these voids were ignored. Fiorelli realized what they were. When the ash had settled over the bodies of those who died, it had hardened around them. Over the centuries, the bodies themselves had decayed, leaving behind only their exact shape, preserved in the surrounding rock. In 1863, Fiorelli began pouring liquid plaster into the voids. When the plaster hardened and the surrounding ash was removed, what emerged was unlike anything archaeology had produced before. Not skeletons, not statues, casts of people, in the exact position they had been in at the moment they died. A man on his back, arms raised over his face. A woman trying to shield her unborn child. A family huddled together against a wall. A pair of brothers fallen side by side. A dog twisting against the chain that had held it to the post outside a house. These were not abstractions. They were specific people, frozen in their last gesture. And the gestures themselves told stories. Some had clearly been running. Some had been crouching in shelter. Some had been holding objects. Keys, coins, small statues of household gods. One man was found clutching a sack of silver, as if hoping to take his savings with him into whatever came next. These casts changed how the world thought about archaeology, because suddenly the past was not abstract. It was a face, a body, a position, a moment. And visitors to Pompeii, then and now, would walk past those casts and find themselves unable to look away. Because what they were seeing was not a ruin. It was the last second of someone's life, preserved by the same eruption that took it. Chapter 4, A City Frozen Mid-Sentence. To walk through Pompeii today is to walk through a city that stopped. Not slowly, not gradually, stopped. The streets are still paved with the same large polygonal stones the Romans laid down. Wheel ruts cut into them. Deep grooves worn by centuries of cart traffic before the eruption. At intersections, raised stepping stones cross from one sidewalk to the other, allowing pedestrians to walk above the water and waste that ran through the streets. The gaps between those stones were carefully measured. Wide enough for cartwheels to pass through, narrow enough for a person not to fall. These details survive because the ash preserved them. Wood survives, wax survives, pigment survives, even food survives. In the bakeries of Pompeii, archaeologists found loaves of bread still inside the ovens, carbonized by the heat of the eruption, but otherwise intact. Some loaves carried the stamp of the baker who made them, a Roman commercial mark pressed into the dough before it went into the oven. The bread was meant to be sold that afternoon, it was never collected. The same pattern repeats throughout the city. In a wine shop, amphorae still rest in their stone counters, round openings designed to hold the jars in place. Some still contain residue of what they once held. In a laundry, workers' tools remain where they were dropped. In a brothel, the stone beds remain in their cubicles, painted frescoes still visible above them, advertising the services available inside. In private homes, dinner tables were set, glasses placed, food in mid-preparation. Some houses have boards leaning against walls, handwritten election slogans painted in red, supporting candidates whose names are still legible. Vote for Lucius, vote for Marcus. The election was for the year 79. It never happened. The graffiti on Pompeii's walls is one of its most extraordinary inheritances. Thousands of scratched messages by lovers, drunks, school children, soldiers, prostitutes, slaves survive across the city. Some are tender, some are vulgar, some are simply boasts. A gladiator named Celadus is described on one wall as the one who makes the girls sigh. A man named Successus complains about a rival in love. Someone has scratched the first line of a famous epic poem in shaky letters. Perhaps a schoolboy practicing. These are not the words of emperors. They are not the words of senators. They are the words of ordinary people in an ordinary city, talking to each other across a wall. And they survived because the ash protected them. The same is true of the frescoes. Pompeian houses were decorated according to elaborate visual conventions, entire rooms painted from floor to ceiling, designed to evoke gardens, mythological scenes, distant landscapes. In the Villa of the Mysteries on the edge of the city, a series of life-sized figures painted in deep red move around the walls of a single room, performing what scholars still debate. Possibly an initiation ritual, possibly a wedding scene, possibly something connected to the cult of Dionysus. The colors are still vivid, the figures still present. 2,000 years after they were painted, this is why Pompeii is not just a ruin, it is a record, a working portrait of Roman daily life that no other source can offer, because no other source survived the centuries intact. Other Roman cities decayed. This one stopped. And in stopping, it told us things we could not have learned anywhere else. How streets actually functioned. How shops were laid out. How houses were heated. How meals were prepared. How people argued, prayed, laughed, traded, complained, and loved. The grand history of Rome was written by elites, by senators, generals, emperors. But Pompeii was written by everyone, by bakers and prostitutes, by slaves and politicians, by children scratching on walls, by a man chaining his dog to a post on the morning of the eruption. Chapter 5. The People Who Stayed. Not everyone in Pompeii died. It is one of the most misunderstood parts of the story. The eruption was catastrophic, but it was not instantaneous. There were hours of warning, visible warning, with a column of ash rising over the mountain. And during those hours, the majority of Pompeii's population fled. The roads out of the city, the harbor, the surrounding countryside, all carried streams of people moving away from Vesuvius. Many of them survived. Some made it to nearby towns and lived out the rest of their lives there. A few are recorded in inscriptions found in other parts of Italy. Pompeian families who reappeared elsewhere after the eruption, rebuilding what they could. But thousands did not leave. Archaeologists believe that a significant portion of the population remained in Pompeii when the pyroclastic flows arrived. Why they stayed is one of the most human questions the city raises. Some surely were trapped, too sick, too old, too injured by collapsing buildings to move. Some were slaves whose owners had fled without them. Some were guarding property, expecting to return after the danger passed. Some had nowhere else to go, and some, almost certainly, simply did not believe the worst was coming. Because what was coming had no precedent. Nobody in Pompeii had ever seen a pyroclastic flow. Nobody had ever heard of one. The Roman world had no word for it. The disaster that killed them was, in their cultural vocabulary, impossible. The bodies tell the rest. In one location, archaeologists found a small group huddled together in a cellar. Perhaps a family, perhaps a household. In another, a single figure was found face down on the threshold of a doorway, as if trying to reach the street. In the so-called Garden of the Fugitives, a group of 13 bodies were uncovered in their final positions. Adults, children, lying together where the flow caught them. What is striking, looking at these casts, is how recognizable the gestures are. A mother covering a child, a man shielding his face, a pair of figures reaching toward each other. These are not ancient gestures. They are gestures any human would make in any century, under the same conditions. And that is what makes Pompeii different from other archaeological sites. You are not looking at people from a different world. You are looking at people from your world 2,000 years earlier, doing exactly what you would have done in the same situation. There is one cast that is often singled out for its strangeness. A figure curled into a tight ball, hands raised, mouth open. For decades, it was interpreted as someone in agony. More recent analysis suggests something different, a posture caused by the extreme heat of the pyroclastic flow itself, contracting the muscles of the body in a way that mimics but does not reflect conscious motion. In other words, the gesture is not what the person did. It is what the heat did to them. That nuance matters, because it reminds us that Pompeii is both extraordinarily vivid and extraordinarily filtered. What we see is real, but what we feel about what we see, the assumed emotions, the imagined last thoughts, those are our projections. The casts cannot tell us what these people were thinking. They can only tell us where they were and how the world ended for them, and sometimes that is more than enough. Chapter 6. The mountain that never left. Vesuvius did not stop in 79. That eruption is the most famous, but it was not the last. The mountain has erupted dozens of times since then, in cycles ranging from a few decades to a few centuries between major events. Large eruptions occurred in 472, in 1631, in 1872, and 1906. The most recent significant eruption was in 1944, during the final months of the Second World War, when lava flows destroyed several villages on the western slope. Since then, Vesuvius has been quiet, decades of silence, and that silence is what worries the volcanologists who monitor it today. Because the longer Vesuvius rests, the more pressure builds inside it. It is now one of the most closely monitored volcanoes in the world. Seismic sensors record every microtremor. Gas emissions are measured continuously. Ground deformation is tracked by satellite, and around the mountain, more than 500,000 people live within what scientists call the red zone, the area that would need to be evacuated immediately if signs of a major eruption began. That number includes parts of Naples, one of Italy's largest cities, which has expanded steadily up the lower slopes of Vesuvius over the centuries. Streets, apartment blocks, schools, and highways now cover ground that was, in 79, fields and vineyards. Towns have been built directly over what was once countryside flattened by pyroclastic flows. Evacuation plans exist. They are detailed, regularly updated, and rehearsed by Italian civil protection authorities. But they assume warning time, days ideally of clear seismic signals before an eruption begins. In 79, the warning signs were there too. Earthquakes, dry wells, restless animals. But nobody knew how to read them. Today, scientists do. That is the difference. The hope is that next time, when Vesuvius wakes up, the modern population will have what the Romans did not: time and the knowledge to use it. But the mountain has its own schedule, and it does not consult the people who live beneath it. Walking through Pompeii today, you can look up from almost any point in the city and see Vesuvius. The same mountain, still there, still green at the base, still gentle in profile. The summit is different now, split, broken into a wider crater than the smooth cone the Romans knew. But it is recognizably the same mountain, the same outline, the same presence on the horizon. And it is impossible, standing in the ruins of a city it destroyed, not to feel something specific about that view. The Romans saw it every morning. They thought it was beautiful. They were not wrong. It was beautiful. It still is. That was never the point. Pompeii is not a story about a volcano. Volcanoes erupt all over the world, all the time. Pompeii is a story about what happens when a disaster meets a city that was not prepared for it. The Romans were not careless. They were not stupid. They had survived earthquakes, fires, floods, plagues, wars, and the rise and fall of multiple political systems. They were the most sophisticated urban civilization of their time, but they did not have the language for what Vesuvius was about to do. They did not know that the mountain on their skyline was a sleeping volcano. They did not know that the tremors in the days before were not earthquakes. They did not know that ash could fall like rain, or that pyroclastic flows could move faster than anyone could run. So when it happened, they responded with everything they did know. They tried to shelter inside their houses. They tried to reach the harbor. They tried to gather their families and their valuables and get out. Some of them succeeded. Many of them did not. And in the centuries since, what their city left behind has done something no other ruin has done. It has refused to fade. The frescoes are still bright. The bread is still in the oven. The graffiti is still readable. The bodies are still in their gestures. This is not the Roman Empire of statues and inscriptions and grand history. This is the Roman Empire of breakfast, of laundry, of arguments in the street, of a candidate's name painted on a wall by someone who would not live to vote for him. Pompeii preserved what no other Roman site preserved, the texture of ordinary life. And it did so by accident, by being destroyed in exactly the right way. That is the strange truth at the heart of this place. The city was buried alive, but because it was buried alive, it never really died. It still exists. You can walk through it. You can stand on the same stones, look at the same walls, see the same mountain on the horizon. And for a few hours, the distance between then and now, 2,000 years of empire, language, religion, and revolution, collapses. Because you are not visiting an ancient world. You are visiting an ordinary day. The last one. This is Pompeii, the city Mount Vesuvius buried alive. And the silence it left behind still has more to say than most cities ever will.
Yeah.